Brian Daniels from the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns. Brian, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committees. My name is Brian Daniels. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Cities and Towns. First of all, I just want to say that we have been in contact and conversation with the administration, the Department of Business Regulation, prior to the budget submission. We've had a good dialogue. I appreciate the open lines of conversation that we've had with them. I think some of the provisions in the sub-A that you have before you reflect some of those changes. Norm Birnbaum came to a very lively executive board meeting with our members today, and so a lot of what I'm going to say today is based on what came out of that meeting. So while we appreciate a number of the changes in the sub-A, we still have serious concerns about the underlying legislation, primarily because of issues of local control. What our mayors and town managers and council members have seen in other communities is that if legalization occurs, it will be the cities and towns that are faced with many of the implementation challenges and impacts. So we may have a statewide licensing regime, we may have a statewide regulatory regime, but a lot of the difficult questions are going to end up at the local level. Senator Metz was talking about some of the zoning and questions about where facilities would be located. That's going to be a local decision. In other communities, we've seen traffic impacts, increases in emergency calls, complaints about nuisance properties. Those are things that are all going to be handled at the local level. So we think that the cities and towns need to have a voice in this. Our members differ on whether or not they would like to have facilities and sales in their communities, but one thing that unites them is that they do think it should be a local decision. Chairman Conley, you talked about home rule earlier. Article 13 of the state constitution gives us the right of self-governance, and questions of local governance, finance, public safety, education are decided by our local elected officials. We think this should be in that category. The legislation, the sub-A, does allow a community to prohibit any license by ordinance, but that's only until 2020. That's an improvement from the original bill, which was 2019, that would have required a special election. We were concerned about the cost and the impact and the timing of that. So 2020 is certainly an improvement over 2019, but we still think that this is something that should be decided by local ordinance. Because after 2020, if you do have a prohibition by local ordinance, in 2020 you have to have a referendum on that, and it's an opt-out referendum. If the opt-out referendum fails, you have to have one of each, the community has to approve one of each category of license, and that's particularly challenging for some of our smaller communities. Our members have requested either going entirely by local ordinance or an opt-in where they could choose certain categories, say we want to just do cultivation and testing, but not necessarily sales. So I think that component on the opt-out requirement is certainly something that we have concerns with. The governor's proposal also has a revenue sharing option, which was described in detail. One of our concerns is that funds are collected at the state level and distributed at the state level by that formula. Now, members of the Senate Finance Committee have heard the League and others express concern in the past about scoops. And anytime there is a bad budget year, what we're concerned about is that 15% that's allocated to cities and towns could be 13%, 11%, 9% based on a bad budget year. The bill does not allow local sales taxes as is permitted in Massachusetts. I think that's something that assuages some of those concerns, because then you don't necessarily have to worry about the state distributing it by a statutory formula. The proposal also does not allow community host agreements as is allowed in Massachusetts. And community host agreements are done in Massachusetts to address local impacts, so public safety impacts, community impacts, similar to some of the ones that Senator Metz was addressing. I believe the sub-A allows an impact fee. We have to take a look at that language, but my understanding is that is a time-limited period and not an ongoing revenue source or ability to have local control. And also on the employment side, that is certainly something that a lot of our members are concerned about. We have people who are in public works, in public safety, who handle heavy equipment. I understand that there are protections for law enforcement and CDLs, for federal guidelines, but I think there's generally a concern about the ability of employers to, the liability that could occur, particularly for public employees if something happens. We have to take a look at the language that in the sub-A to see what's addressed there. I think there's also the concern about the on-site testing and the ability to do the testing. Some of these issues may be governed under collective bargaining agreements. So just because something is allowed in law, it may be restricted in collective bargaining agreements. So that's something that we're going to have to talk about with our members in light of the new language. But overall, we appreciate the progress that we've had with DBR, but ultimately we think that there needs to be greater local control, both in the decision-making as to whether or not communities allow these types of licenses, and also greater opportunity for revenue sharing.
Thank you. Any questions or comments for Brian? Senator Sosnowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Brian, for being here, for your testimony. I have a question on the present situation now in the cities and towns. When a medical marijuana grower, when they establish a facility in a city or town, are they abiding by the local zoning?
I have to double check. My understanding is that there are, some communities do have prohibitions on growing in their communities. So I do think that is a local decision, but I have to double check that.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator DePalma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brian, thank you for being here. I concur with you with regards to all the concerns you bring up about local control. But granted, we can do this if we do it across the board to everybody. But you're right, Article 13, Section 4 of the Rhode Island Constitution on the Home Rule Charter, as the Chairman articulated, and you have as well, is how our cities and towns operate and govern themselves on a regular basis. I can just imagine a place like Little Compton I represent. I'm not certain there's even a demand to have that, yet the state's going to say you have to have each one of those. That just seems inappropriate, number one. With regards, though, to the referenda, I firmly believe a local ordinance they'll have a couple hearings on the ordinances. I'm not certain, I think we need to follow a little more with regards to why the referendum is there, if that's what Massachusetts has done or other cities and towns have done. But from ordinances are put in place all the time on all kinds of things that govern people's lives in cities and towns, potentially more drastically, maybe not. I'm not certain. I don't know how drastically this will impact, should it move forward. I think from an ordinance perspective, it can certainly handle it that way. And I know in some of the cities and towns I represent, we're moving forward with a local ordinance, but they basically said, well, let's hold off since the state may be doing something. It may be too premature to do that. But they've done it, and they've done it in other areas as well, where they've restricted certain things of being able to place in this particular zone or that particular zone, or done it to the point where you just can't put it in the town based on, quote unquote, how it's zoned. It wouldn't fit anywhere, so to speak. And that's the city and town wouldn't have to like it. That's for that city and town and the governors, councils in that cities and town to articulate. So thank you for being here, and thank you for representing the cities and towns in that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. So I also would like to thank you for your testimony on a couple of the issues for the cities and towns. The analogy to the scoop is to the scoops that this committee remains very concerned about in this budget is very real. We know that now that has become not a strategy of last resort, but it's become a foundation element of the budgets that are being presented to us, and that's very concerning. Also, we see what happened, what's suggested to us should happen to the pilot money this year. And that's another example of where the cities and towns are looked to when there's a need for revenue. So that's a very real concern about how this is allocated and how ephemeral those allocations can be. Thank you for bringing that to attention. Thanks for getting on the record this evening that there's a local sales tax incentive in Massachusetts to assist the local communities and addressing the burdens that come with the location of the facilities. And they'll, again, if not to say that each community, if they want it, that's fine, but I think you're correct that, especially if you look at what we just said this moment ago, but it's becoming a history of looking to the cities and towns for revenue to the state, that we provide that independent source of revenue to the municipalities. I think that's important to have a part of this discussion, so I appreciate you bringing that to our attention.